And welcome to Delightful Dissent. It's episode 37, and we're going to be talking about doing things the hard way. And they say I've been told many times in my life that I was doing things the hard way. Um, and sometimes it's been really helpful, and sometimes it's really not been helpful. So I'm really interested to get into and pick apart what we mean by that, how it works, and um, and really to give us maybe something. I've often heard like, "Why don't you just?" as well, which is you know, which is a phrase that just straight away makes me react. So I am really interested to get into all of this. And today's guest is Helen Read. She's a consultant psychiatrist and founder of ADHD Consultancy. So thank you very much for joining us, Helen. It's great to have you on the show.
Thanks for inviting me, Matthew.
So if you're new to Delightful Dissent, it's an idea that came up with my work, through my work with people who are really taking a different approach to things. And when you do take that different approach, you often find yourself tripping over and challenging conventions that are kind of unspoken and implicit. And I think Helen's definitely one of these people and doing this work. And I really think it's important to get these ideas out there because they can hold all of us back. But perhaps more importantly, I want to give everyone an experience of being able to do this for themselves and really challenge the conventions themselves and what it is to do that. Really, it's also about exploring and normalizing the not knowing, not having the perfect answer all the time, which is a huge thing. Whenever you work with anything complex, you're never going to know for sure. You don't have that certainty. But we have this kind of professional persona that we kind of know and have this absolute certainty. And I think it's really important to share what it is to explore and to do that and to do that well. And it's delightful dissent because we are challenging stuff. We are going to say, we're probably going to go against quite a lot of convention and conventional wisdom, but it's not about arguing and proving ourselves right at everyone else's expense. It's about exploring and being playful with these ideas and doing it slightly differently. So yeah, hopefully it's going to be, it's fun for us and it's fun for everyone listening, as well as being kind of learning and seeing things in a new light. So yeah, this show is genuinely live. So if there are any technical difficulties, please do bear with us. There may also be difficult topics. So obviously we're going to be talking specifically around neurodiversity and ADHD today. So if there's anything in that space that might be challenging for you, then just please do be warned. There's also the possibility that we might use strong language. So again, if that is an issue for you, please do be warned. So yeah, there aren't any perfect answers here. It's about asking questions, questions of yourself, and asking us questions too. So if you're watching live, please do comment, and you can, and we can bring in any questions. And if you're listening to or watching the recording of the show, then our details will be available first of all in the show notes and at the end of the show, so you can get in touch and ask us any questions there. So yeah, I first met Helen when actually I reached out to her when I was exploring my own ADHD diagnosis, and I found it was so rare to talk to a medical professional who got it and feels like they really got it and gets it without having the effort of self-justification and exploration and kind of exposition that always was previously involved. And also it was so great to not feel that I was about to say something that was taken the wrong way. Which is again is a very common feeling a lot of neurodivergent people have, I think, interacting with any bureaucratic system, including things like the NHS. So but I want to let you introduce yourself a bit and so what you do and the people that you work with, please.
Okay, well, so I run ADHD Consultancy. It's a private practice which is specifically about diagnosing and treating ADHD and related neurodevelopmental conditions, so autism and the variety of sort of conditions which cluster around those. I started ADHD Consultancy about 3 years ago. And at the time, I was still working full-time in the NHS as a consultant psychiatrist, running the ADHD service for a London trust, but also that was only one session of my 10-session time. The other 9 sessions were taken up with running a sort of standard GP entry-level psychiatric referral clinic, which is work I love to do. But interestingly, the 4 years, as I was becoming more and more sort of aware of ADHD and how much there is of it, and I didn't have my own diagnosis at that point, but I think everybody, including me, has always assumed that I do have ADHD. I have got myself diagnosed now because it seemed a little wrong not to have that diagnosis. But I have been on treatment for a long time for various reasons. So so I think the thing that made me really branch out and start my own thing was just realizing how difficult it is for people to access this, diagnosis for this condition, and how many obstacles we face. Talk about doing it the hard way. We have no choice but to do it the hard way. If you want to get a diagnosis of ADHD, you are basically almost certainly going to have to pay in this country these days, and that was the same before the pandemic, to be honest, although slightly less so.
Yeah, and
So yeah,
not only that, there are so many barriers. I think one of my abiding experiences, and I obviously relatively recent with an ADHD diagnosis, but actually had a dyslexia diagnosis very young. And one of my abiding experiences of dyslexia, which obviously affects your ability to fill in forms in particular. And how many services will you'll say, oh, I'm dyslexic, and they'll give you this long, really badly designed form to tell them about how you're dyslexic. It's like, I've just told you that this is going to be really difficult, and you've given me the most difficult thing. And so there's something, I completely,
yes,
it's a huge thing.
It's a huge thing, isn't it? And I think I'm remembering that I have forms in my clinic, but really they are instead of the sort of 4-hour journey that it would otherwise take to go through people's neurodevelopmental history. Because the most important thing, if you're going to diagnose ADHD, is showing across someone's lifespan, whatever their level of talent, whatever they're doing, they've had to work harder than other people. They've had to do it the hard way. And they will often have a sense of not having achieved their potential in some way or other. And that feeling, that sort of experience is what you need to elicit. But I think I was going to say that, that when I was running that service, what was really incredible was that in the 90% of my job where I was supposed to be seeing people who don't have ADHD, what really emerged with all those, so many of those people, not all of them, but a surprising majority actually of those people, was just how many people with chronic anxiety, treatment-resistant depression, life's difficulties. Do I have bipolar, doc? I can't get on with my work. The kind of things that bring people into psychiatry. Actually, when you sit down and talk to people, when you build up a rapport with them, it doesn't take long before you get to a place of, well, I was never able to listen in class, or, I was thrown out of school. I was, I've never been able to keep a job for too long. These things just emerge, and it astounded me how much undiagnosed ADHD and neurodiversity there really is, which I think was a big driver for me starting my own practice so that I could offer that service to people. And I know that being neurodiverse myself, as you said, Matthew, it gives you a big advantage when you're working with neurodiverse people, and particularly when you're talking about medication and things like that. I think we can just recognize each other. Of course we go through the normal thing that you have to go through, but it doesn't seem to be as hard. Like I hear colleagues talking and they have this sense of, we have to winnow people. We've got to pick out the people who are pretending to have ADHD. Now, I personally have never met any of those people. I don't know where they are, but, I think that by contrast, the people who I do see are practically dead before they will drag themselves to a clinic. They really have tried everything else, and they are flat and on the floor and exhausted. So I think that's an example of a place where the paradigm just doesn't fit really. And I think to the disadvantage, of course, of neurodiverse people. Always we're doing it the hard way. We can't, we have no choice, to be honest.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is really interesting. I think that one of the phrases, well, there's a lot of language. I really I find how language is used fascinating, and using and like to be able to play with it and kind of.
Yes. Yeah.
And one of the things I often find really interesting is how the whole cluster of neurodivergent conditions are often called unseen or like hidden conditions or invisible conditions.
Mm.
Um, and they're not invisible if you know what to look for at all. I tend to prefer subtle conditions or overlooked conditions
Yes. Yes.
um,
Yeah.
rather than. But it's a really interesting one, and I completely resonate with that
Mm.
very much with that you kind of know
Yes. That
on
that
some
sort of
level.
feeling of recognition. Yeah. Yeah.
And I've had this interesting experience where so many of my social group have had diagnoses in the last few years, um, and not because of anything. And if I look outside of that social group, it's not like a huge number of people getting diagnoses. It's just there was some kind of we kind of knew our own even before we knew what that was.
Totally, absolutely, and I often say to people in the clinic, because people feel very bad about themselves. I think that is an overriding uh, quality that I notice in my clinic. Shame, that horrible sense of burning shame, and often it's my partner has to look after me. I'm not pulling my weight. I'm not the person I should be. Actually, there's this lovely concept called assortative mating, and it applies to friendship as well. Actually, it's when we are really resonating with people, when we're choosing people to be in our circle, if we're neurodiverse, they're very likely to also be neurodiverse, and that's not an accident. Presumably, the reverse applies with neurotypical people as well. Uh,
Yeah, I
yeah,
guess so. I mean,
Mm.
I think it's really interesting how there is a kind of relief in a sense that
Ah,
comes from being around people who because I think if you're different to most people around you, you automate the filtering. You automate you so you're not consciously aware of it. It's just when I'm not doing it, it's a relief. And so
uh,
I'm suddenly like,
yeah, good.
I think of it, the metaphor I use for those of you who are either thinking about, oh, maybe I am actually, or if you want to understand what this is like, if you are neurotypical, and is I think of it as a bit like a fluent second language. So for me, speaking to a neurotypical world and operating in that context is like a fluent second language. It's
Mm,
so fluent, I'm not thinking about it. I'm not thinking, oh, what does that work? But it is still effortful in a
mm.
way that my native language is not.
Absolutely, and I think that even the speed at which we speak, the classic form of speech in ADHD, as I really worked this out from meeting so many high functioning, wonderful, amazing people in the consultancy. This has shown me a lot about high functioning neurodiversity. It's something that I might have put down to, well, that's just me being weird or mental. Once people start to tell you that it's their experience too, then you realize that clearly this is a bigger thing, and actually perhaps I'm not. Well, you're not so weird and mental. In fact, this is an ADHD thing. Not that the two are obviously mutually exclusive, but they. So, but yeah, I mean, ADHD people, we're relaxed and excited about things. We do tend to talk too fast, and the effort of filtering that is in itself quite difficult. One of
Well,
the things I say to people when I first see them in the clinic is, if it's okay with you, do you mind if we interrupt each other if we feel like it? And they say, wow, that is such a relief, because the feeling of holding on to what you want to say while politely waiting for the other one to finish, as Matt has right now, so, can be quite painful. Yeah.
it is really difficult, and also the
Mm.
tangenting. I
Yeah, well,
think
that,
that's
yeah.
that's
Mm.
the other part of it,
Yeah.
and it's an interesting exercise to do this in this particular circumstance. And some of my other guests have been neurodivergent as well,
Sure.
but it's always very interesting because as a kind of host, aware that we're holding context for other people to be able to engage with the conversation, um, and trying to remember that when the cues from the person in front of me are that I can just go off and don't have to hold that is a very interesting experience. I think it's a really how much we do kind of automate this is a really really interesting one, and I think that's definitely this all kind of plays into today's topic. But before we get into it too much, I like to ask my guests to bring a quote along. So have you got something, Helen, that you'd like to share to kind of get us going on this?
Absolutely. Well, my quote, I tried to look for some others that were perhaps more immediately relevant, but I'm coming back to old Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Man is born free, but is everywhere in chains. And I think this so speaks to the experience of, we make complications, we make our lives harder. Why are we doing this? Why is it a human impulse to somehow build difficulty into our lives that doesn't need to be there?
Yeah, I really like that. I think it's the weird thing about that, I think, is that that for someone, for many of us, it's some of the chains are our own,
Oh,
are of
yeah,
our own creation, and
totally.
that's the really
Mm.
weird thing about it.
Yes.
I
Yeah, yeah.
think that's when you start to get into it, it's like that's, and actually often one of the complicated things about this. So one of the huge things I work with people around with their this kind of intersectional privilege and marginalization, because I
Mm.
work with essentially professionals, with
Yeah.
neurodivergent professionals. So they've actually usually had quite a lot of privilege in their life.
Mm.
And then they've got this neurodivergence, which gets marginalized. And so it's a really weird thing to negotiate.
Yeah.
um,
Mm.
and we end up complicit in the system that's actually causing us harm. And the
Yes.
chains are kind of all right. So it's a really interesting, difficult thing to work with and to explore.
I think so, and particularly, I'm going to say in a slightly different way, being a doctor with this condition, because obviously the paradigm is different. The way of looking at things is different. The treatments are different. It so far has not been okay, really, for me to say in colleague meetings and things like that, well, because I take these medications myself, let me tell you that actually this is what's going on and that's what's going on. I'd love to, but I feel very inhibited from doing that, because I have spent my career knowing that this is a culture where I can't pass for normal. I can in the world generally, I can meet anybody and be fine. Something about being with doctors, I can't put on that front. I can't fake the doctor personality. And so I think I might have gone off topic, actually, Michael. Sorry.
No, I
Yeah,
don't.
yeah.
I think it's really interesting because for me, the one of the really difficult things around many of us who adapt to, who happen to have the either the internal resources or the developmental resources to have adapted successfully to some
Yeah.
degree of success.
Mm.
um, we tend to we then tend to mask.
Yeah.
We very often have that like layer, and the real difficulty with that is that the strengths and the weaknesses are very often kind of two sides of the same coin. So
Yeah.
the masking actually prevents us from being able to be like our full self and our full
Yeah.
strength and our full effectiveness. And in
Yeah.
a work context, particularly when there's stuff at stake,
Yeah.
when you really care about that, because certainly, in my previous careers, when I've really kind of pushed the boundaries and been obviously neurodivergent, is actually when stuff's at stake, because
Yeah.
I've had to get that out there and I didn't have a translated way of doing it.
Yeah.
And so I think there's something really interesting in that, and like and yeah, the way of doing things, that one fixed way, and you have to step outside of it because you have this different way of doing things actually. You're kind of always translating. um
Exactly. Yeah. Yes.
but when it really matters, when there's pressures on, when you really care about something or whatever, it you can't, there isn't the nicety of being able to do the translation all the time.
Absolutely, but I don't know whether you found this at all, Matthew, but for me, those times in my career have been the times when I've got myself into trouble, more than other times, because there is this idea. There are so many names for high functioning neurodiverse people, because I think we don't have a really formed concept of what it is. And I think one of the names that I've come across is being a catalyst. And there's a fantastic book about this, isn't there, called Work Fast, Break Shit and Burn Out. And I often refer that to people to that in my clinic, because it's so much what we do. And I found the times when I really care have been the times when I've taken it too far, without intending to. You must want to see that I'm right. It's so obvious that this is the right way to do it. It's like 2 + 2 is 4. Why can't you see it? And sending that extra email, it doesn't generally pay off, unfortunately. Perhaps it has done for you, I don't know, but it certainly hasn't done for me.
Yeah, I think this is really, this is the hard thing, and one
Mm,
of the things about doing things the hard way for me is that there are there are kind of hard problems in everything that we work when we work with any complex system, with people, with organizations, with groups.
mm,
You come across these complex, tangled, wicked problems, the knotty problems,
mm,
um, and quite a lot of standard practice is kind of designed to kind of avoid them slightly, or because you can't directly work on them in quite the same way.
mm.
They defy solution in an obvious way. And I think when we are aware of different things, and it's not that we're more aware necessarily, it's just a different constellation of
I
things
think
that we
so,
tend to
yeah,
be aware of.
totally.
We see things that others don't, and concomitantly we don't see things that others do,
Yes.
both of which can be problematic in a professional
Totally.
context.
Yeah, absolutely.
um,
Mm,
but because we see things that others don't, first of all, there are some problems that we sense that people are simply unaware of. Second of all, there are problems that are intractable to us that are tractable to others. And thirdly, there are problems that are tractable to us that are intractable to them. And so it's all of this stuff mixed together leads to being accused of being like always doing things the hard way, always like seeking hard problems. And
mm.
I like hard problems. I work
Yeah,
well with them.
totally. Mm.
My whole, I ended up niched basically doing the stuff that no one else would touch.
Mm. I think it's a
Um,
specific neurodiverse talent actually, is to sort of see through, if you like, the trees for the actual wood, to see the
mm,
concept. But I think one of the things perhaps we can miss in that, because it's so obvious, is perhaps, the importance that neurotypical people and organizations place on your place in the hierarchy, how you deal with the hierarchy, and I think to many neurodiverse people I've spoken to, in fact, quite possibly all of them, that's not very meaningful to us naturally. We have, we know what it is, but, if we have a good idea, of course they're going to want to hear it. Like, why wouldn't they? And of course, you don't realize that because you can't see this stuff. And I think the neurotypicals can see it. They probably see us, probably see me behaving in a way that is, contrary to what is expected, but I'm personally unaware of it. I don't realize in what way I'm prejudicing the outcome of what I'm actually trying to say by, the fact that it's across this divide between neurodiverse people and neurotypical people in organizations.
I think, yeah, I'm aware. I've known I was hierarchy blind for a long time,
Mm,
actually, and it's had some really positive benefits too.
mm.
Because I've found that I often end up in conversations with very, very senior people,
Yeah.
um, who who are actually often very lonely and get very little information and get very little because everyone else sees their position,
Mm.
and because I'm blind to that, I just
Yes.
see a person to talk to.
Yes. Yeah.
Um, and so actually we often get on very well. What happens though is the people between me and them then find that very difficult to navigate.
Mm. Absolutely.
Um,
Absolutely. And
and
it's, yeah.
so that's often the source of friction for me. And I think this relates to, for me, it's like there's a model, there's a way we've agreed is the easy way,
Mm.
and we have to do it that way. Otherwise, you're rocking the boat, you're causing problems. It's that stepping outside
Mm.
that feels like is in itself is a transgressive act. It's a problematic thing, and particularly, I don't know whether this is more I think it's the neurodivergent experience in general, but there are traits in ADHD that make it even more likely. Is the transgression without realizing that you've crossed the boundary,
Totally. Yes.
particularly because of the external processing that comes with
Mm.
ADHD and the verbal processing.
Yeah.
So I don't really know what I'm saying until it's come out of my mouth.
Mm.
And if you work that way, it's great for working things out and doing this kind of work inside.
Yes.
But equally, if you're going down a tangent that people find threatening or problematic, you don't know until you're in a room full of people kind of staring open-eyed and slack-jawed at you.
Mm.
And it's that because I don't have that barrier in me, because I sense into the world kind of slightly differently, a different way of organizing things.
Mm.
I don't know I'm coming up to that, so I don't know I should probably tone it down a bit. So I kind of blunder right over it.
Totally. I completely relate to that. And I think also, yeah, it's clearly not everybody neurodivergent, but I have become aware that it takes me significantly longer to actually interpret people's facial expressions unless they're quite extreme. So many times in my career, I think I have failed to pick up, that when people say, what a great idea, come and talk to me about that later, what they really mean is, I never want to hear about that again. But I don't pick that up, so I'm quite surprised when they don't appear very keen to hear the idea afterwards, because they said they were, and they should be, because it's a good idea. Yeah.
It's weird. So I have I have the hyper empathy experience, and
Me
that's
too.
weird
Mm,
too,
mm.
because I kind of have a knowing of like something about the sense of a person. When that doesn't line up with their words,
Ah,
or doesn't line up with their some element of their expression, because I could never tell you why I know that.
mm,
I could never say, because it never is one thing. It's
mm.
always like the whole situation. But I find it very, very uncomfortable when the two don't line up, and so uncomfortable that it becomes overwhelming, and I'm kind of unaware of then everything.
Absolutely.
So
And I think, yeah, I think that often applies to professional behavior,
it really does,
it
that
really
professional
does.
detachment, and yeah.
Oh, the detachment, and smiling like a wolf instead of like a friend. I really think, and I've talked to clients about this. Again, it's something I can bring here, because having spoken to clients, I realize it isn't just me. And, leaving the NHS now in May 2020, and doing the clinic full time has really triggered a process for me of reevaluation, reframing, looking back. And, I realized that that I wasn't as well liked as I thought I was. I just assumed, of course, everyone likes me. I'm a great person. I'm good at my job. I work hard. Why wouldn't they like me? People outside work generally seem to like me. So, but actually, I didn't pick up the signs quite often that, in fact, I was rocking the boat a little bit. I was saying things that people didn't want to hear without really being able to pick that up. And I think it's the gap sometimes between the words and what everybody else knows that they really mean.
Mm.
So I'm talking, a good example,
Yeah.
improve the patient experience. Clearly that is the mantra of the NHS. It's constantly changing all the time about improving the patient experience. This is meant to be central. So, but of course, that doesn't mean that, that is the first priority necessarily, or that, improving the patient experience beyond a certain point that people have decreed is where the threshold is. Beyond that,
Yeah.
why are we doing it? Why are we doing it? Well, obviously we're doing it because we care about the patients, but, this, I think, is often where the confusion comes in.
And I think that very often it can become, whenever you get a laudable aim like that,
Mm,
is that they can become these kind of sacred, unchallenging values that can be used, first of all, to invalidate anything that doesn't fit with the existing model, and
mm,
second of all, to it's like, well, we can this does that, this thing improves the patient experience. It's like, for everyone, all
yeah.
the time,
Mm,
really, in
yes.
every circumstance.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
And that's never going to be true, but it becomes a kind of a truth, and then we end up having to fit around it. If you don't fall in that, if that doesn't apply to you, you end up with these extra barriers and these extra bits, and the
Mm,
I find, it's very difficult to navigate. And
mm,
one of my challenges is that, because there are these kind of hard bureaucratic things, and a lot of life actually has to be, I just have a limited capacity to deal with them every day. I
absolutely.
can't do
Yeah.
that more
Mm,
than,
yeah.
and then I can't do anything else either, which is the other problem, because everything takes a little bit of that. Some things give you it back, and some things are rewarding, they're worth doing it, and that stuff isn't in either of those categories. So it's very depleting.
Mm,
Um, and then you end up kind of being stuck in the case where you kind of literally can't do anything, because you've used up all of that resource that you need to do anything.
Yeah,
And when I say
totally.
can't do anything, that includes like making food or putting the TV on or like just
Talking.
moving,
Yes.
talking, definitely. And
Definitely.
and and I think that experience, I suspect there are other things you could do to basically anyone who would put them at the point at which some of their mental resources were so depleted they couldn't really function.
Yes.
It's just that for some of us, we encounter those in normal life, and some people don't.
Uh,
And I
I
think
think
it's a
neurodiverse people do. Generally,
yeah,
that's one of the things
that's kind of
about it, isn't it? Yeah, absolutely. I
yeah,
think so.
and I think that's part of what. And very often, when I'm told that I am doing something the hard way, what I'm actually doing is avoiding that depletion.
Very sensible indeed, absolutely. Yeah, and I think that that brings me to thoughts of medication, which is kind of quite a, obviously doing what I do. That's going to be quite central to how I sort of see this problem. And I'm constantly struck in the clinic. These wonderful people come in, absolutely flat out, just as you described, Matthew. It's the world is I've come to conceptualize ADHD rather than a sort of state of deficiency, rather moving on from all this business about this bit of your brain is smaller, that bit of your brain is smaller. I've never been able to believe that my brain or anyone I know with ADHD, that their brains are smaller. And in fact, that now has been discredited, which is great. It's more like being a slightly different kind of person, in a world that isn't really built along the lines that we would ideally need it to be built along, and that takes it out of you. So an awful lot of the issue with high functioning ADHD, it's not that we can't do things. Generally, we can do all the things, but it's how much harder we have to work to do things, and therefore, when it gets a bit more stressful, we're already exhausted because of our life is always 10 times harder. So I think that's probably why we're more prone to that sort of thing. That possibly than other people, and sensory issues as well, of course, which are also quite normal, I'd say, in the neurodiverse community. Often things are not set up for us that way, are they?
Well, and again, I think it's a question of degree. It's like it's just that there are some sensory things that I'm more sensitive to. It's not that people don't care about,
Yeah.
say, the texture of their clothes. It's just that I will experience an uncomfortable texture as more
Yes.
distracting than other people
Yes.
will.
Yeah.
It just get filtered below kind of conscious awareness for many people. For example,
Yeah.
like a label, which is the classic one everywhere.
Classic.
It's
Yes.
like one of the markers of high, like sensitive neurodivergent sensitivities is cutting the labels out of clothes.
Totally.
And clearly they don't bother that many people because they put them
Yeah.
in there. And so, but, and so I think that partly this, and the using tools, I think, is a huge part of this. And for me, I understand medication as part of a toolkit
Yeah.
that people
Absolutely.
may choose to use at certain stages or for a long time or for a short time, or it becomes part of a range of things that you can use, and that they're very often complementary to one another. I think this
Totally.
is very often this gets talked about as like, okay, you do this and it's cured. It's
Mm.
like
No.
a pervasive developmental condition that's lasted this long and one thing is going to cure me.
Yeah.
Really? How
Exactly.
likely is that? As a,
Exactly.
and the fact that, otherwise intelligent people will tell you that is a very strange,
It's bonkers, isn't it?
it's not something I've
Mm.
fully like
Yeah.
dug
And
into.
and what is a cure? Because again, many people in the clinic, there is this sort of fear and revulsion and feeling that you're giving into something if you take medication. It's somehow wrong. Um, and I think a lot of people will say, well, will I lose will I lose the things that make me special? Will I lose my creativity, my sparkling personality, my ability to read the room, all of these things that we love as neurodiverse people? That's too high a price to pay. And fortunately, we shouldn't have to pay that. If we've got the right medication, we should be able to do it the easy way with all the other things as well. It's just a tool. I say to people, it's kind of like taking the lift up to the first floor. You've still got a lot of work to do after that, but at least, you're not flat out on the floor, unable to function. You've got something that you can do, because we can't change the world immediately. We can't change our vicinity, unfortunately, how we would like. So we often have to cope with difficult environments and experiences. What can we use to help us, and is it legitimate?
And it is that range of things, and
Mm,
uh, yeah, it's a really, the idea of cures, I think, is problematic on a lot of levels. Again,
insulting.
for
Yeah.
me, one of the interesting experiences of a lot of my own journey and a lot of people I work with is actually as they explore this and develop the capabilities associated with their neurodivergence,
Yeah.
they often become more manifestly neurodivergent.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think I am, if you met me 5 years ago, I was well masked
Mm,
and well dissociated and, completely cut off from a lot of that, which I'd learned
mm,
in an environment where it was necessary. Um, and as I've released that, I'm actually more obviously
mm,
neurodivergent now. And that's come partly through using things like medication.
mm,
Um, and it's a weird experience. And I think the idea that one is cured and therefore becomes normal is, for me, it's more like, okay, I accept that I'm ordered differently. I'm always going to be organizing things differently. The word that I'm just at a kind of angle compared to
yes.
most other
Yeah.
people,
Yeah.
kind of on a tilt. My experience is slightly tilted.
Mm,
Um, but that doesn't mean that there isn't an ordered way of working within that. And for me, that's what I'm looking for. And when I say doing things and this relates directly to the hard way thing, because at an angle actually means there are easy ways available at that angle that are not available through the normal way. And so that's where the really big strengths come from and the things I can work with and the things I can do. And it's always been one of the things, and it's actually one of the things people learn to mask, I've noticed, is actually certainly I've learnt I read ahead in kind of
a lot of
what's
people
going
do that.
on, partly
Yeah.
because I need
Mm,
to
mm,
function well
mm,
and to integrate. But I always get into trouble for that. It's that,
mm.
like, stay with where, and the boredom that comes with that.
Ah, exactly. Knowing what someone's going to say. People who speak too slowly, these things are very difficult
There's like
to
one thing,
negotiate.
then another thing,
Oh,
then and
oh, it's painful, absolutely painful, and it's and yes, it's it's very difficult to deal with that. I think so. This is another thing that is hard, but I think it's not that our perspective or way of doing things is wrong per se. I really don't think it is, but clearly those of us who are aware of being neurodiverse, those of us who are sort of out there thinking about these things, are very much the minority. We set the diagnostic threshold at a point where people with the top 5% of these traits will get the label. Clearly, people beneath that probably also would benefit from all of this, but the line has to be drawn somewhere. But I think because we're in the minority, it's always us that has to adapt. Yeah, and I think there's a wonderful theory that I came across some while ago, the double empathy theory, and this particularly is supposed to be about autistic people, but I think that it has a lot of relevance to ADHD as well, and I think in this regard there's often a bit of convergence or a little bit of overlap there in the two conditions. But people always say, don't they, if you're autistic, you can't read social situations, you lack the ability to read body language and blah blah blah. But actually, some research has been done that shows that neurodiverse or autistic people can understand each other perfectly well, as can neurotypical people understand each other very well. But always the difficulty is across the divide. But always that's going to be our difficulty because we're going to be the ones who are needing to be heard. And contrary to the prevailing kind of narrative and way of doing things, we're coming in just that little bit differently. And I think that people generally, when they see something different, they feel uncomfortable and they instinctively sort of recoil a bit from it. And certainly as a doctor, my strength has always been with my patients all through my career. My patients have always, it's not to boast or anything, but I think I think a lot of patients are neurodiverse, and that's probably related to that thing. But that's not what you're judged on as a doctor. It's are you able to be this sort of one step removed person, this very sort of, I mean, I'm not illogical. I'm a very logical person, but I am passionate. I'm passionate about the things, and I'm passionate about my patients, and and that's somehow not quite right. It makes people uncomfortable. And really interestingly, many times, I think, or not many times, on several occasions in my career, I've become aware that sometimes my colleagues have drawn the conclusion that I must not be a good doctor because I set off some sort of, I can't not be neurodiverse. When actually, if there's one thing I can do, it's looking after patients, which one might think would be fairly central to the job. But, it's nuanced, it's interesting.
I think that, there's an idea of what a good one of whatever looks like.
Yes, that's
We
it.
have
Yeah.
this idea, and I think there's also an idea of identification and one of the really big things I've noticed with the display of neurodivergent traits
Mm,
is, because they do have this tendency to be overlooked,
mm,
is that when someone realizes actually someone's different,
mm.
when they had previously identified with them on a in whatever
Yes.
level, but on a professional level in particular, there is a well, it's I mean, it is genuinely horror. It's revulsion,
Mm.
because there's a category violation going on,
Yeah.
and that the cognitive dissonance and the category violation is really very difficult for anyone to deal with.
Yes, it
And
is.
what
It
then
is.
happens is it tends to be projected out at the individual who's causing it, rather than rather than actually sitting. Well, actually, no. Maybe my models. There's a maybe
Yeah.
this is maybe they can be both.
Yeah, maybe
um,
everyone doesn't have to have the same personality, actually. Maybe everyone doesn't have to. There shouldn't be one face associated with success, professionalism, expertise. In any field, neurodiverse people will probably not have that face unless it's a very neurodiverse field. But you're missing, a lot of really important stuff if you exclude those people, because you're missing the people who. Yeah, I've never heard anyone except several neurodiverse people of my acquaintance say to the effect of, if I'm doing my job properly, I should become redundant. I don't think you can say that if you're neurotypical. And yet, how wonderful is that? How wonderful to give that to your task, to bring that passion and caring, and a lack of self. I mean, it's clearly not very sensible. And I'm sure on a personal level, we would advise people not to be like that, because one has to look after oneself. But, for an organization, what a treasure, to have someone who genuinely isn't thinking of themselves first, but actually genuinely wants to bring a better experience. But it's missed, I think, and it's to the detriment of
Yeah, and I think
yeah.
this definitely plays out. If we're talking about people doing things the hard way, one of the big
Mm,
things with organizations is they spend ages kind of training people to be, people should be selfless. People should think outside the box.
mm,
Most people with ADHD have a much weaker, like, phenomenological sense of self
yes, totally.
than
Mm,
other people report having. I can't say that they don't have it, but that's what
yeah.
the other people seem to report,
Mm,
and don't really have a cognitive box in the first place. So why would you hire someone and spend ages kind of trying to change them into something that has those traits,
mm,
instead of just hiring someone who has those traits? If you're
absolutely.
talking about doing things the hard way,
Mm. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think there is change, though, Matthew. Don't you think? It's
yeah,
there are now many more areas and professions where people actively are aware of the value of neurodiverse people, which is great, and it's a benefit for all concerned. I think the world is perhaps becoming more neurodiverse, which is interesting. But at the same time, coming back to the language thing, actually, which is, if there's one. Everything I've discovered in my clinic has been personally and professionally fascinating in the last 3 years. But I could talk, for forever about these things. But language is so absolutely central. We live in a language-based culture, and yet actually it's almost universal among people that I meet. When you ask them about it, people with ADHD, obviously, that I meet in the clinic, actually, we're hiding a lot of difficulty with actually listening, actually processing. Auditory processing is a problem. It often doesn't show up on tests because, of course, we are driven by dopamine with ADHD. So we have an interest-based rather than an outcome-based sort of way of operating. And so, of course, if someone says, I'm going to give you a test, well, obviously, that's very interesting, isn't it? So a little bit of dopamine, there we go, absolutely perfect. excellent skills, but that doesn't relate to most of the time when it is just literally impossible to listen to people. And when you do listen to people, I see in my clinic, I do a 2-hour assessment, and of course people are listening there because it's very important to them. By the end of that time, a lot of the people I see are sort of, they're exhausted, their eyes are closing, they're leaning forward, and these are highly intelligent, professional people. This is a great handy, this is not an advantage of neurodiversity, certainly not in a language-based world. And this is something that medication can help with. And I think if anything else, it helps us to make our place, to not be exhausted, to be able to just privilege language in a way that, is now the norm.
It's interesting experience for me because I'm visually very weak, but I
Mm,
have quite well developed auditory and
mm,
language. So um, it's a really really difficult. It's an interesting one for me, and for me, there's something actually about this validity of a different way of doing things. Is again, this comes partly from the masking and the expectations that come out of conversation,
mm.
because if I attend in my natural way, I am kind of listening. I am taking stuff in. It's just I won't have the recall of detail and the precise stuff and the order of things that other people might expect of me. And so
Absolutely.
again, if I'm interacting in a normal situation, that's problematic because someone will be like, well, but for me, if,
Mm.
in the right circumstances, it's just a different kind of attending. And
Yes.
I think that being able to, a lot of this feels to me like, we can't go there all in one go. This is one of
Mm,
the really big things about it, but that doesn't mean it's not desirable to get to a point where we
mm,
don't have as many of these challenges as possible and actually shift the environment. One of
mm.
the big things about, for me, is that about ADHD is this acute sensitivity to environment and context.
Oh, totally. Yeah. Mm.
Um,
Yes.
and that actually a lot of my work is about creating structures outside so
Mm.
that I can so stuff just happens.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Mm. Uh,
And
yeah.
but that takes energy and takes control,
Mm.
and using things like medication to be able to do that and build a wider degree of being kind of comfortable so that we can explore
Yes.
and have that
Yeah.
feels like a big part of the work.
Absolutely, because we are having to span a divide. It's as if, like you said, it's like another language. We have to convey our ideas. We've got to develop some proficiency in that language, and that will always take more out of us than doing things our own way. So, if you like, I think ADHD medication is in a way it's non-specific. I mean, obviously, it boosts our dopamine. It boosts our ability to do things that naturally wouldn't be that interesting to us, which is, unfortunately, a large part of 21st century industrialized life. It is not particularly exciting. The ideas are exciting, the daily grind, the routine, the meetings, the things that are not the way that we need them to be, the sheer slowness of how everybody talks, the need to have these massive meetings about everything and have a consensus. And I think often the neurodiverse person, certainly me, is sitting there knowing they can't speak because of course you know that it's not going to work, but feeling, why are we still talking? Surely it's obvious. It's obvious what we need to do. Yeah. And so, yeah, so I think that does take it out of us quite a lot. And it is doing it the hard way. But, improving our language is clearly a good thing. Improving our ability to listen, and our ability to operate in the world where we find ourselves, which is very much a language-based world, with an auditory education system, and given that I don't think I've got hardly anybody in my clinic who actually learns in an auditory way. We tend to be visual kinesthetic. It's hugely disadvantageous. It's very disadvantageous to our kids. And I came into ADHD really because of my eldest son, and then the fact that he was diagnosed with autism at 3. He's 24 now, and there wasn't really anything for him. Despite the diagnosis, despite what people could do, he often wasn't really taking things in that much in the classroom. And that's why I went on my quest to find what could help him. And that's how I came to medication in the first place, because the boosting effect on language processing, it's almost, I would call it, to the extent that you might say, well, to the extent that you might find the concept of, the ADHD could be about having slightly more of those hunter-gatherer genetics, which is quite a prevalent theory out there. There's the lovely book called A Hunter in a Farmer's World, which really expands on this. It's intuitively attractive. Obviously, we have no idea if it's true or not, but certainly there are things that we're not so good at, as well as things that we are good at. And language, I think, is absolutely top of the pile. If we haven't got the ability to really listen to things and take things in, and adapt our speech to be linear when it needs to be. It's great to be non-linear, but sometimes when you want to communicate with people, you've got to make it linear, haven't you?
And I think a lot of absolutely. A lot of this is actually about finding the words,
Yeah.
and that work is valuable. I think this
Yes.
is the other side of this is that very often we can kind of assume that our experience, that because we've kind of had that experience invalidated on some level, that actually being able to develop the language around that is a huge way of delivering and sharing our value with the world. Because some of that value does come from our ability to see the world differently.
Totally.
Then comes with the challenge of explaining it.
Yeah.
And for me, I think there's a huge amount around experimentation and what works and finding what works for you. And this is true across interventions, and it's true across like how you work with it too. Because one of the big things is, if your mode of expression is not primarily verbal, are you better with maths? Are you better with diagrams? Are you better with whatever? It doesn't actually matter that you don't have to use exactly the same one. You can convey what you want to convey in the manner that works for you. And I think, but playing with that, experimenting with that, and experimenting with approaches that help you do that, give you the energy, give you the, are a huge part of this, and that includes medication. Like what works, trying stuff out, and allowing yourself the ability to kind of get good at trying stuff out.
Definitely. Strategies. Where would we be without our strategies? And, I think I use the term high functioning ADHD. I know the ASD community don't like the term high functioning autism. Yeah, but, I'm quite happy, I understand totally why we wouldn't like it, but at the same time, we've got a group of people like you, like me, and I think one of the things about this is that you can use these strategies to mask from everybody how difficult things are, and actually, often I think we mask it from ourselves as well, until you become aware. But these strategies are vital, and of course, because the neurotypical world is in some ways, quite opposite to how we need to do things in lots of ways. When we're looking for answers to how can we make our life easier, how can we avoid doing things the hard way, we need ADHD strategies, which are often the other way around from what people say. And I don't think people can't understand this, because the paradigm is, even for people that I see in the clinic, they need to shift their paradigm. They need to move over to their own paradigm and stop trying to do it the hard way.
And I think stopping. I think that there is value in translation, and that is important. But I think that can easily fall into trying to be the same.
Yeah,
and that's a very, very different thing. And I think stopping trying to do that, is am I adapting, or am I actually trying to change in a way that is fundamental? And it just isn't going to happen. It's just really hard and painful and miserable, and I think letting go absolutely is and that actually frees up capacity to do the adaptive stuff.
Absolutely. And I mean, who would want to, I don't mean to insult anybody neurotypical, but it would be my worst nightmare to wake up and be a neurotypical person tomorrow, because, from my vantage point, it doesn't look as much fun, and one thing about ADHD is that you can really enjoy life in the right place. You can have unusual ideas. You can do, things that other people wouldn't do, and see things in a different way. And that can only be valuable, albeit, again, sorry to come back to medication again, but actually being able to have some dopamine supplied by medication frees us up sometimes from some of that impulse, some of the dangerous side of that impulsivity, which of course many of us have experienced as well. And people can and do, come to serious harm through being very, very impulsive. And many of those people will be neurodiverse. In my opinion, we know that, substance misuse, for example, we know that 25% of people with substance misuse issues will have undiagnosed or diagnosed, probably undiagnosed, because that's why they've got an issue, ADHD. I would strongly suspect that the real frequency is a great deal higher, because it's so dopaminergic to seek relief and respite, and to change how you feel, and to be drawn to the perverse, the forbidden, the edgy. All of these things are very dopaminergic, and so if you have a brain that is seeking dopamine and constantly needing it, of course everybody needs dopamine, but neurotypical people have enough dopamine for their life, and we don't have enough dopamine. So this is why
it's
that's what it is, really.
the things that most people find rewarding are not as rewarding, and I think
Absolutely.
it's
Yeah.
and concomitantly, interestingly, that other things are rewarding. And
Oh,
I think
totally.
allowing yourself to basically enjoy what you enjoy
It's
is
amazing, isn't it? It's so liberating.
such I
Yeah.
think that as a fundamental, it's like I was trying to, not only was I doing, if we are doing things the hard ways, doing things the hard way to get something I didn't even really want.
Yeah.
which because it was the right thing to do, because I kind of
Yeah.
expected, and I think that for me really, is a really interesting place to kind of start to wrap it up, is absolutely
Totally.
that allowing yourself to explore and to do this
Yes.
stuff, and to
Yeah.
find the things that you really find rewarding, because they're
Yeah.
valid.
They're not only valid, but they're authentic to who we are, and there's a freedom for anybody in finding and connecting with their authentic self. And very much, I think, again, I say to people in the clinic, yes, we're talking about what happens on the day. It's lovely to be able to listen properly and not procrastinate, and, have a much easier day and a more productive day. But actually, I would say the biggest benefit from, using medication as part of your toolkit is, that over time your journey becomes towards who you authentically are, to your authentic place in the world. And you can't use ADHD medication, and probably any other kind of ADHD treatment, to achieve one of those fake goals, that we all have striven for in our lives so much. That sort of falls away a little bit, and I think the real
Other people's
stuff
goals,
comes
they're
out.
not fake, they're just other people's.
Well, yeah, exactly. So they're fake to us, they're
Yeah,
not
they're not really
exactly.
ours. Yeah.
Yeah, and when we don't have them anymore, we suddenly think, "Oh, that's quite a relief, actually." I'm pleased not to have to do that anymore. I don't miss it.
Which
Yeah,
I think is why, why it can feel very hollow when you're
yeah,
following. It's like you expect the reward, and it's not rewarding because it's not yours.
yeah,
And
exactly.
I think, like, being able to listen to that feedback and work with that feedback is and these are skills that you build over time. So
Yes, it's such a
it's a
journey,
really,
isn't it?
really, really important kind of, to be
It's
able to
such a
explore
journey.
that.
And it makes me happy, every day, running the consultancy, knowing that I can help to launch people on that journey, to help them, find out who they actually are. It feels like such a rewarding thing to do, and I'm sure you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think and interestingly, it's related to this. The I think that only for the last little while have I really started to experience things feeling easier.
Yeah. Mm,
Um, and that for me is such an important marker.
mm,
Um,
mm,
that things feel easier. Things don't
mm.
have to feel hard and harder all the time. Um, That is a really big thing and really important thing. It's true for everyone. No
Yes,
one should have to do things the hard way.
no
That
one
isn't.
should.
But
Yeah,
particularly for neurodivergent people who have the message reinforced to them in a
totally.
certain
Yeah.
way,
Mm.
I think the message that, yeah, actually things can get easier, and if they're not getting easier, there are things that we could potentially do to allow that.
Yes, and it's
Is
not
a
that we're
really big thing.
lazy. How many
Mm.
people say to me,
It's not a
I mean,
Yeah.
"Am I just lazy?"
No
Lazy
moral
is
judgment.
lazy is the opposite of what people I meet are. They're going 24/7. I mean,
Yeah.
we may have an output issue, that's for sure, without, as things go. We are trying all the time, so much harder than anyone else can possibly imagine. And the fact that we think we're lazy is just, this we have to lose this, it's ridiculous.
Yeah,
Mm,
definitely. No,
mhm.
I think it's there's things people have to not worry about anymore.
Yeah,
Worrying that you're
yeah, yeah.
lazy, yeah,
Oh,
no, doesn't exist.
Doesn't exist
No,
whatsoever.
it
Absolutely.
doesn't exist. It's not actually a thing.
Mm,
So yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much.
yeah. Thank you.
Ooh,
Sorry. Alarm. Oh,
um,
alarm. Alarm's
uh,
doing it the easy way.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, definitely. And it's a
Mm,
great example of using support
yeah.
structures
Yeah.
and
Absolutely.
getting
So
video.
important.
Yeah.
Mm.
So yeah, thank you so much. If someone wants to kind of get in touch with you or find out a bit more about your work or anything, what's the best way for them to do that? How can they
The
kind of
best way
engage?
will be to, if you Google Dr. Helen Read, my name, ADHD Consultancy will come up. You can Google ADHD Consultancy.
We've got a link to your website in the show notes
Oh,
as
there we
well.
go.
So
So
yeah,
email is always the best way to
brilliant,
contact. That's how we operate generally. I am on
fantastic,
LinkedIn, but I can't say I look at it every day. But I do look at it sometimes. No,
cool.
no,
Okay,
yeah.
brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Mm.
thank you. It was really, really interesting. I think there's a lot to follow up on there. We've just about kept to an hour. Peter's about to go over the hour with the
Yeah,
outro, but I think there's so many interesting things in that space that we could go deeper on. So yeah, thank you.
totally.
I hope I hope if you're listening and it has kind of triggered some stuff for you, then please do get in touch with one or either of us because
Mm,
it's it's core to both of our work. And for
totally.
me, it's personally valuable as well as
Totally.
professionally
Mm,
valuable. And I think
mm,
that's part of it becoming easier actually.
mm. Yes, finding your
Um,
tribe
yeah,
at last.
exactly.
Yeah, finding your
And so
tribe.
I'd be
Mm,
always welcome those conversations.
mm. Me too.
But yeah,
Yeah.
so if this
Mm.
has resonated for you, yeah, please do share it out, get the message out there. If this whole set of ideas and this approach kind of has been interesting, there are other related things. So you can check out the back catalogue on YouTube or on your favorite podcast platform. If you just search for Delightful Dissent, you'll hopefully find it there. If you're interested in kind of connecting with others and doing this and working kind of my work, you can find it on divergentpathfinders.com. I'm exploring stuff around community and kind of finding our
Mm.
tribe and getting people together.
Yes.
So
Mm.
be very welcome to have any interest and contribution there. Um, and if this did get you thinking, yeah, just do reach out and ask either of us.
Totally.
Um,
Mm.
the next episode, and very interestingly, it's always funny how these things kind of weave together in
Mm.
unexpected ways. Talking about the experimentation and the security to do that, we're going to be talking about safe to play.
Ah,
When it is safe to play, and we get this message. I've certainly picked up this message. First of all, that play is kind of unchallenging and isn't really doesn't really isn't
childish.
really meaningful, childish,
Yeah, yeah.
whatever.
Mhm.
And second of all, this weird message that I had to have done everything else before I could play. And this is one of the things, particularly as someone so dependent on having some energy and some motivation,
Mm,
is that thing of like you can go and do that when you finish your whatever chore it was or whatever.
mm.
And it's like that will take me so much longer and be so much more depleting than if I kind of bounce between the two or kind of,
Yes.
this kind of idea that we have to finish everything before we can play and be safe and that's okay and there won't be consequences is something I'm really looking forward to
I'm
getting
looking forward
into.
to listening as well.
Yeah, thank
Mm,
you. And so that's going
mm.
to be with Charles Anderson Kier, who is a facilitator of play and social anthropologist. And I'm really, really interested to get into that. So I do hope
Cool.
everyone can join us for that. That's going to be at 1 p.m. UK time on Tuesday, the 12th. So that's kind of next week, but slightly earlier in the week. I hope to see you then. But in the meantime, please do go out there and make some delightful dissent of your own. Goodbye.
Goodbye. Thank you.